This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Today, Brian Kisida, an associate professor in the Truman School at the University of Missouri, joins us to discuss a new Education Next article that he co-wrote exploring how high school students learn about critical race theory in America's classrooms. Then, on the Research Minute, Amber shares a study about how test-optional policies at an elite private college hurt high-achieving disadvantaged students. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show. Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming my special guest for this week, Brian Kisida. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mike. Hi, David. It's good to see you.
Yeah, Brian is an associate professor in the Truman School of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Missouri and co-director of the National Endowment of the Arts sponsored Arts, Humanities, and Civic Engagement Lab. That is a crazy long title, but Brian, so glad to have you on the show.
Yes, it's great to be here.
Yeah, also joining us as always, a man with a much shorter title, my co-host, David Griffith.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Brian. Good to see you.
Well, it is Monday as we tape this here in Washington, D.C. I don't always say that, but the news is moving fast around here. It's been a little bit crazy. We've got, as of now, I think a trade war may be happening, although maybe not. We've got the stock market down, then maybe back up. We've got, agencies that are maybe being closed or maybe not. I'm fielding calls from reporters about the Department of Education getting shut down, and I'm trying to tell them, no, it's not. So there's a lot going on. But behind all of this is something we've been living with for years now, which is the education culture wars. Something that I sometimes try to avoid, even dismiss. I know some of my friends on the right think I'm too dismissive. And as my colleague and friend Robert Pendicio points out all the time, we can't avoid culture wars because schools impart parts of the culture to young people. We have to weigh in on what that means and what that looks like. Brian is here because he and his colleagues have done a great new survey digging into this question of what is actually being taught in America's schools about race. He's written it up in a great article for Education Next, and we're going to talk about that on Ed Reform Update. Okay, so Brian, tell me, first of all, did I get that right? Is it fair to say the survey is a look at how schools teach about race?
Yes, but I think that we were more specific. We didn't kind of cast a huge net. We really wanted to try to shed light on the specific question, are things that are characterized as critical race theory related, critical race theory adjacent, being discussed in the classroom. And I have to sort of offer that qualifier about critical race theory related because for a couple of years now, there's been this, scourge of people talking past each other. One side saying critical race theory is an obscure legal theory that happens in college and is never taught in public schools, while the other side says that it's woke indoctrination that is rampant in our schools. And truthfully, both sides are kind of missing the point, I think. There are things that have come to be known as critical race theory that aren't maybe technically critical race theory that some people are uncomfortable with. And so we really wanted to drill down and ask, we did a representative sample survey of high school students, and we asked them, throughout your experiences in high school, did your teachers make the following claims or arguments? And we tried to pinpoint, some of the specific things that critics of so-called critical race theory had been, railing against and passing legislation to stop. So we really focused in on those types of things.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. And this, as you say, is so important because we have been talking past each other. And, it is hard to pin down exactly what do we mean or what are people worried about? And the concern here is not just that schools might be teaching this obscure theory, right? The concern is always about indoctrination. That is
exactly.
right? Are people on the left or the right, anywhere on the ideological spectrum, taking advantage of their position, being in schools and basically trying to indoctrinate children in their own political views? And that's something that we have a lot of concerns about, right? Okay, so let's get
Yeah.
specific. What were some of the specific things you asked about, and what did you hear from, again, high school students, right? This is a survey of kids reporting what they're hearing.
Right. So some of the headline findings that we write about. So more than a third of students in our survey reported being taught often or almost daily, for example, that America is a fundamentally racist nation. 34% of students have heard frequently that, quote, police officers are inherently racist against Black Americans. 20% report that teachers have said that white people should feel guilty about their privilege. So these are the kind of things that we would put in the category of divisive types of statements or claims. And, I think that this is what we have found is that these findings are a bit of a Rorschach test, depending on who you are, whether or not you think these are high numbers or low numbers. Rick Hess had an interesting piece in Ed Next a few months ago where he reported on a conversation that he had with people on opposite sides of this, where one side said, oh, it's happening in less than 1% of schools, and the other side said, oh, it's definitely more than half. So we're finding somewhere in the middle. We also wanted to see if students were receiving messages that paint maybe a more optimistic view. And so we also asked students some other types of questions. And so what we found is a majority of students actually report being taught that the United States has made a lot of progress towards racial equality. I think this comes in around 50%, 6%. And 42% have heard their teachers claim or argue that the United States is a global leader when it comes to ensuring equal rights. So a sort of a half, glass is half full, half empty kind of story. We're finding, mixed messages out there from the students. Of course, these could be different sets of students reporting different experiences.
All right, let's drill in on that a little bit. First, let me bring my skepticism here. Should we believe the students? Should we believe the kids, right? It's a hard thing to know on any of these kinds of surveys, right? Are they giving an answer they think you want to hear? Or, if they think that this might be something that happens somewhere in some schools, they say, oh yeah, I've heard a teacher say that we're fundamentally racist. How do you think about that?
I think it's difficult, and I don't have a lot of faith in anybody responding to surveys, much less high school students. I would say that the responses line up at least internally consistent. The things that you would expect that they'd heard more often register at higher numbers. Things that are pretty obscure. This idea that teachers would separate students by race for purposes of small group conversations, that number comes in pretty small. So internally, it seems consistent like that. But I fully acknowledge that it's hard to know exactly what to make of this. But at the very least, we can say like, well, one side can no longer deny that this at least exists and it happens. How much that it happens and how much we should be worried about it is a matter of public debate. I also would like to.
I was just going to say, and Brian, I'll be honest. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on was that the numbers to me were surprisingly high, right? Because I have been somebody who has argued to my friends on the right, hey, yes, I'm sure this is happening. It's probably happening here, and where my kids go to school in very liberal Montgomery County. I know there's been some of this stuff that's been happening, but we live in a bubble, out there in America, in real America, there's probably not as much of this going on. So having a third of kids or 30% or, some of these numbers are pretty high. So if it's true, and it, again, maybe exaggerated, maybe not, that's pretty shocking. Anything, can we dig in on where these kids are, when they report on these findings? Do we know if the kids themselves, what their race is, socioeconomic status, or anything about their schools, or, are we hearing different things in blue areas versus red areas? Anything about that?
Yeah, I can shed some light on that. So in terms of, demographics, we have a representative sample, and we're able to look at students' political leanings and their race and various other aspects. We haven't seen any differences along, the lines of partisanship among the students themselves, But what we have done and what is not in this paper is we've merged in vote share data, so county level vote share data, and then merged those data in. And there is a strong correlation. If you're in a county that is more, if this kid is living in a county that is more likely to vote for Democrats, they are more likely to hear these types of messages. So that's a correlation that we'll publish in a future piece. And I think also to your point, as far as being skeptical and seeing these numbers as high, I think it would be wrong if I didn't also acknowledge that we don't know the specific context these things are being brought up in. So my preference, as a person who studies education policy is that I would want these things to be discussed in a critical way, right? So, in a good classroom, there might be a teacher who's able to say, here's some people making this claim that America is fundamentally racist. Here's other data that looks at progress. Here's other claims from people who are critics of this idea. We can't really parse out how many of these things are happening in good, healthy classroom conversations. I'm sure a portion of them are, and how much is what we would call indoctrination, which would be presenting these things uncritically without an alternative viewpoint.
Well, for your next study, you just have to put an Alexa in every classroom in America and then listen in and have AI figure out, the context. Okay, David, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I feel like we should ask AI how we can resolve our differences or something, right? Yeah, I have largely the same take that you do, Mike. I mean, the numbers seem high to me, and as I've dug into this, I've come to realize that just sort of dismissing the concerns and saying there's no data when it's something that's almost very difficult to collect super granular data on is a little bit, it's dismissive, right? And so, you have to kind of hear people out when they're saying, I don't like the tone, or I don't like I don't like the messages my kids are getting at school. And the numbers are high. I guess the main thing I would say to conservatives, right, is that I don't think legislation is the answer. It's very tough to legislate a thoughtful conversation, right? The right answer is to talk to your teacher. And if you're still concerned, then maybe the right answer is to change schools, right? But you may not be concerned after talking to your teacher. You may find that he or she has a nuanced view of a lot of this. I do think it's true that a lot of the sort of rhetoric around anti-racism penetrated very deeply for a few years. And I find that I have found the rhetoric frustrating as someone who thinks it's important to sort of confront America's imperfections, right? Because just mouthing the words is not the same thing as actually doing something about it, and constantly sort of engaging in this sort of off-putting language wars is probably the worst possible way to get people to actually authentically engage with the issue. So, that would be my message to liberals, right, is to sort of drop the rhetoric, give people the benefit of the doubt, and kind of try to discuss these things like a normal person. But that's my personal take.
Yeah, no, that's well said, David. I'm curious for you, Brian. When you were thinking of doing this survey, or when you see these findings, and you mentioned that you would love to see teachers handling these issues in a critical way, but based on the findings here, I don't know, is this good news? Is this bad news? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so it's good that David is here because, as you know, my co-author Gary Ritter was unable to be here, but David is going to play that role very well. So I'll play the more alarmist role since David's going to hold down the other side. I think that, when you say that the numbers are surprisingly high, we'll take another number from the survey, which is only 56% of students report that they've learned that we've made progress. That is shockingly low. That is shockingly pessimistic. And then David mentions the legislation. So very few of the bills that have been passed actually explicitly mention critical race theory or what books should be assigned. These bills actually are written in a very sort of colorblind way, in the sense that If you look at some of the language, so a Missouri bill, for example, would ban curriculum that, quote, identifies people or groups of people, entities, or institutions in the United States as inherently, immutably, or systematically racist, sexist, biased, privileged, or oppressed. If I read, between the lines of most of these bills from the language that I've seen, they're asking that we treat the findings of social science and our treatment of individuals as separate things. So we can look at social science and we can look at history and we can see that certain groups and certain institutions have acted wrongly, but most of these bills are essentially saying, don't make white kids feel guilty for something they had nothing to do with. And so in that sense, I'm not as alarmed that there's a reaction, even if it's, somewhat of a reaction and something that maybe we think isn't a huge problem. I don't think that the overreaction has been a huge problem either, if we actually look at the letter of the law.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's good that you reminded us about the low numbers for, the more optimistic statements about America. You're right. That is shockingly low. And, if I had a hypothesis, if you came back and did this a couple of years from now, I suspect that anything that sort of feels like critical race theory, there'd be less of it because it does feel like, as David said, that was a moment, 2020, 2021, 2022, the woke period was pretty intense and it feels like it's receding, right? And we'll see if there's a new round of it out of a resistance to the Trump administration. But so far, it doesn't seem like it. I don't necessarily know that means, however, that more patriotic perspective is going to grow, right? What would it take to try to get more American kids exposed to the idea that we are making progress on race and on almost everything else, or at least we have as a country over the large, long scope of things. Maybe this is my now middle-aged into old man frustration. These kids don't know how much better things are today than they used to be. That's always a problem with every new generation, right? They just don't know. They didn't live through it. That's why you study history and try to get across this point that, God, lives were tough back in the day and things were bad. And the country was way more racist than it used to be. And we're not perfect yet. We should keep working on it. But man, we should be grateful for the people that fought some battles before us. David?
Yeah. I respond with my typical ingratitude, Mike. No, listen, I just want to respond to what Brian said really quickly, because actually I agree about the legislation. I don't, if you actually go in and read the bills, I didn't find a lot to object to in the letter of the law. I think my point is more just that, it's not going to come as a surprise to anyone that America's teachers are a little bit to the left of the American public. That's been true for a long time. It's probably going to be true 20 years from now. We can't teacher-proof social studies education, right? Like we have to work through teachers. And so, ultimately, I just am skeptical that passing a law at the state level is actually going to get teachers to embrace the sort of nuanced, balanced, grateful, self-reflective kind of attitude that we want them to, right? In order for that to actually happen in an authentic way in the classroom, they have to believe in it, right? They have to internalize it. And it's kind of difficult to define what it is, but I just don't think that it's something that you can sort of change those classroom interactions by writing passing a law in the state legislature. I don't know, Mike. I'm a little more optimistic than you. I think most people do understand that there's been progress since slavery. I think most people get that. I think for many people on the left, they consider sort of I guess sort of constructive self-reflection to be the sort of highest form of patriotism, right? Mm-hmm. And that you love America by trying to make it better. And I guess that's probably the sort of charitable interpretation of how a lot of people approach this and why they sort of embrace a lot of this way of speaking and thinking about it. But I actually also agree that there hasn't been nearly enough emphasis on what's working. And that's getting to be a problem. So,
all right, gang, we're going to have to leave it there. Brian Kisida at the University of Missouri, Truman School. Go Mizzou, go Tigers. Brian, it's It's great to have you with us. And again, congrats to you and to your colleagues on just a great survey and a really good paper. And glad we can finally bring some light to this topic, which has been the source of a lot of heat.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, I got to ask the first most important question. What do you think? Beyonce, not just album of the year, country music album of the year for Cowboy Carter.
That was a lot. I did like the Cowboy Carter song, which was the headline song, but I will admit that I did not listen to any other song on the album. I mean,
Really?
I just didn't. Sorry.
Oh, you got to listen to the Jolene cover is very good.
Oh, you're right. I did hear Jolene. You're right.
Okay.
Jolene and the Cowboy song. I heard
Yes.
those two.
Yes.
So I can't say anything until I've listened to the rest of the album,
Okay.
I have to say.
Hey.
But hey,
It-
I know
it's-
a lot of people were happy because she kept getting slighted.
She did, especially for album of the year. And look, the country music, which I know you're a fan, it having an
Yes.
impact on culture. I mean,
It
crossing,
does.
borders,
Boundaries.
genres. Shabuzi was in there in the mix.
That's right. That's right. It's a welcoming community. Love the country music scene. And
Yes.
hey, Taylor didn't win,
Yeah.
and she was gracious giving the award to Bay. So
Yes. Yes. Okay. We'll see if her boyfriend does any better next weekend. We'll
yeah.
surely talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
it here on your pop culture update. Okay, but we
will.
are also here, of course, to talk about education research. What you got for us on that front?
We have a good one this week. It's a new NBER study from a trio of Dartmouth economists. They're looking into test score optional policies that have been implemented in recent years. Specifically, they're looking at the effects on elite college admissions for high achieving applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds. They have data on all applicants from fall of 2017 and 18 when test scores were required, and fall 21-22 when test scores were optional at Dartmouth. They omit scores.
Hold on, Amber. I thought it was an unnamed elite private university.
No, they're out with it. It's Dartmouth.
Oh, okay. All right. Yes. All right. Good.
They're all three from Dartmouth. So I think they had to say this elite colleges were the
Yes.
one in which we work. So
Mhm.
they admit the scores that were most affected by COVID in 2019, 2020. And they have a ton of data, student demographic, SAT, ACT scores, high school GPA, class rank, Pell Grant eligibility, first generation college going status, the income percentile of the neighborhood the kid lived in, the information on the high school attended by the student. How do they define less advantaged? They were the kids who were either first generation US students from a neighborhood below the 50th percentile of US neighborhood family income, or they attended a high school among the 20% of the most challenged high schools in the nation, which I think there's some measure that uses neighborhood education and crime rates, among other things, to sort of categorize the challenge of neighborhoods. But the coolest part is they have test scores from a subset of students who agreed to send their scores to Dartmouth, but later they decided they didn't want them reported. So, and I think that's normal, right? You can, when you first sign up to take the SAT, you say, I want to send it here and here. And then you can say later, okay, I want it included in my application profile or not. So the analysts were able to leverage these hidden scores in their analyses, regardless of whether, they were included in there. And they had to do a bunch of weighting to make sure that they were representative and so on and so forth. But that was sort of the new thing, is that they actually had access to scores that weren't reported publicly. Lots of interesting findings. First, they find that during the test optional years, what do you think? I'll just take a breath here. What percentage of applicants do you think chose not to submit a score after they had the option to submit the score?
At Dartmouth?
At Dartmouth.
25%.
David, what's your guess?
I have no idea. I really don't. I can't
Play
decide.
along, David.
I don't know. 10%.
46.
Wow.
40%, 46% of applicants chose not to submit a score. On the other hand, the sheer number of applicants jumped 35% compared to the test required years, which means they had 2,400 spots in both scenarios. They had 42, which was news to me. They had 42,000 kids applying for 2,400 spots. And then that rose to 57,000 applicants after this test optional thing. Despite the increase, this is another interesting little factoid here, the characteristics of the students applying to Dartmouth remained the same or very similar. For instance, the average GPA stayed around 3.8, regardless of that policy.
That's because everybody in America has a 3.8 or higher. Come on, give me a break.
Well, the number of AP courses they took also remained about the same. They found that SAT and ACT scores strongly predict in linear fashion the first year GPA at Dartmouth and predicted equally well across income groups and other measures of advantage. So it was kind of stable across the groups. You'll find this interesting. The SAT by itself explained 22% of the variation in the first year GPA, while high school GPA, prepare yourself, high school GPA by itself explained 9%. When they put together the GPA and the test score, it only explained an additional 3% of the variation compared to the SAT alone. Next, they find that conditional on their score, the likelihood that an applicant submits a score is similar across demographic groups as well. So, for example, if you're a kid and you've got a 1400 to 1440, you are about 50% of the time you're going to submit your score. Again, no matter what your level of advantage. And then they found that the less advantaged kids who didn't use their scores, so didn't report their scores, had admissions rates of about 5%, and that those rates didn't correlate much with their hidden SAT results. And then when the less advantaged students did send in their scores, their SAT scores, especially when they were below 1,300, they did tend to be penalized. So it wasn't favorable to them. But they were helped by the scores when they were above 1,400. So the big headline finding really was that less advantaged, high-performing kids tend to lose out if they don't report their scores. And in fact, they when they were able to look at these hidden scores, they saw that if you were high-achieving, meaning you had a score around 1420 on your SAT, they could increase their admissions probability of getting in from 2.9 to 10.2% if they had reported their scores. And then the high achieving, similar, they had different measures of advantage. The high achieving first generation applicants also saw that. They would raise their admission chances from 4 to 10% if they had submitted their scores. And in fact, an SAT score of 1,400, 1,440, the less advantaged kids have an admissions rate of 8% compared to 3.8% for the advantaged kids. And then they made a point to say, you know what, since Dartmouth's the 25th percentile SAT score at Dartmouth is 1,440. So that means that, that can still be a highly competitive, score for your lesser advantaged kids. And then, in fact, when they looked at the better off kids, the more advantaged kids, submitting their test scores was less consequential because the chances of admission were positively correlated with their test results, even if they didn't submit their scores. So they said, okay, this might suggest that they demonstrated their skills elsewhere in the application, or that the admissions officers tend to know the wealthier schools better. They're more familiar with them than the less wealthy schools. And they also say that, that they think that these kids need to submit these things because it appears that admissions officers identify around 1450 a certain signal that says, you know what, this kid's an impressive kid. He can achieve a high score in spite of the challenges that are also reflected in this application. And they end up saying, it looks like test scores actually help, rather than hinder social mobility for high achieving, less advantaged kids.
Wow. It really powerful. And the cynical view here is you'd say, okay, based on this study, then we should get rid of these test optional policies, but they don't want to because they want to be able to admit some rich kids who wouldn't otherwise get in because they want their money or they want their, parents to give a big donation. And so, if you're rich and you don't donate, you don't submit your scores, maybe that's part of the strategy. Anyways, for poor kids, I think the message has got to be, hey, send them in, and you'll be surprised that it might actually help you. Do you think that, am I reading between the leaves here, that they have found a way to basically have a lower standard for the test scores for kids coming from various forms of disadvantage?
I mean, obviously that's not the way they're going to say it, but clearly, that the scores are the scores, right? I mean, they're, especially when you see that kids with a 1440, are likely, to get in relative to if they've got that, if they do have advantage. But it's also, I thought, interesting that, they just don't know it, right? It's sort of like it's hidden. We talk about the hidden curriculum and all that information, and these kids think they're going to be penalized, but they're actually may not be. So yeah, I mean, I think that could be true, but it's also true that we're not advertising this in any way, shape, or form.
Well, and it would be hard to know. Oh, go ahead, David.
Yeah, sorry. I would just want to make sure I'm getting it. So if you are a low-income kid and you include your score, your odds of going up, of getting in, go up substantially.
Yeah.
But it's not like they were admitting drastically fewer kids from these communities, right? So basically, getting rid of the testing requirement just means you admit different, sort of low-income Black and Hispanic kids, not more or fewer, right?
Right. I mean, you mean in the past, it was 5% of advantage of period, right? And then they said that the characteristics of these kids overall didn't change drastically when they changed that policy.
Right. So you're admitting different kids. Within these communities, you're not sort of increasing or decreasing the number of them.
And by using the test scores, you admit kids that are more likely to be successful once they get to Dartmouth.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that, Mike. I just want to make sure.
which is good. But look, so much of this is opaque. I mean, I guess you could tell somebody, hey, if you've got the score that's at least at the 25th percentile, you should submit it. That it could be a piece of advice. But like, some of these kids may not know that they're, quote, low income. I mean, if you're at the 50th percentile, or your neighborhood is at the 50th percentile, I mean, some of this stuff is not super clear, right?
That's right.
So I don't know. There may be some kids. Some of these kids are middle-class kids. Working class, certainly middle-class kids. Who may not know that they're actually going to be given maybe a little bit of an advantage because they don't know. They don't know. I mean, I remember growing up in suburban St. Louis. I used to think that our family was like super rich, and it was only later that, when I left the Midwest, and I was like, oh no, these people on the coast, these people are really rich. Now I get it. Anyways, I just don't know that when you're 17, it's hard to know where you might fit in some of these different styles.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, if you were, able to get a high score and you grew up in a, pretty hard part of town, and another kid grew up in a nicer part of town and got the similar score, you might say, hey, this kid's got something scrappier, than maybe we recognized before. But now that we've got, a full picture of information with the score.
So has Dartmouth then gotten rid of test optional? Or they say everybody's got to send
They went back. Yep. They went back to the test required.
All right. Well, good for them. Hey, database decision making. I love it.
There you go.
All right. Thanks. Very interesting, Amber. And of course, look, this matters, for all kinds of reasons, but especially for these high achieving, lower income students as we think about serving them well in high school. And so I hope those high school counselors out there pay attention to this as well. All right, gang. All right, gang. I'm afraid that is all the time we've got for this week. I think that maybe David had even less time. He had to go take care of some things at home. But Amber, thank you so much. And until next week,
I'm Amber Northern.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.